I'm so pleased that you could join us for the Ontario Caregiver Organization's webinar series. These webinars bring together caregivers and subject matter experts to explore topics of interest to caregivers. And we do this to support and engage family members, friends, coworkers, spouses, siblings, anyone who's taking care of somebody else. My name is Katie, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. We begin this gathering by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. While we meet today in a virtual platform with people joining us from across Ontario, and as we've learned internationally and nationally, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. The land that I'm standing on today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendships of Indigenous peoples. As team members and as an organization, we're learning about the lands from which we work, exploring how we can be meaningful allies and how we can support the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we do this to affirm and reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. So we invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land where you are. And if you're not familiar with that, that's okay. We're going to be sharing an interactive map that tells you which traditional territory your city or town sits on. And for those that are joining us after the live webinar, you can find that at native-land.ca. So I'd love to get to introducing you to our topic today and our speaker. As mentioned, we are so excited to present the topic of creating a life you love. And the information shared today is going to empower you with tools and techniques to elevate your emotional and mental health well-being. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Natasha Sharma. So Dr. Sharma is a leading authority on emotional fitness, an entrepreneur, and one of Canada's top TV media personalities. As an internationally recognized professional on psychology of relationships, parenting, and emotions, Natasha has helped thousands of people lead better lives through cultivating emotional fitness. Natasha is also the creator of the best-selling book, The Kindness Journal, founder of the 8-Hour Therapist, founder and owner of NKS Therapy, a private psychology and therapy practice in Toronto. And she enjoys helping people connect to their emotions and achieve optimal emotional health. So welcome, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm very, very happy to be here and with you all today. So today's workshop is going to be about creating a life that you love, that you don't want to take a vacation from. You want to take a vacation for vacation, but you don't want to escape or feel like you ever want to escape your life. And I want to start off just by sharing a little story. Earlier this year, I was interviewed by, I'm often interviewed in the media, but this particular radio interview was focusing on me. And actually, they wanted to know how some personal elements about myself, what a turning point was for me in reaching this sort of approach that I have to life, and how I kind of got behind this sort of positive movement or mindset and what it even means. And as I was doing the interview, I realized I actually haven't had a large aha moment or a big turning point, but rather life is actually comprised of both, mostly actually, tiny, imperceptible moments that create massive change in our life, timing, circumstances. And then there are the occasional aha moments, if you want to call them, or grand moments. That can really be the impetus for change. So that was really interesting to share with them. But whether we're experiencing really small, tiny things on a day-to-day basis, or huge shifts like what we're going through on a global scale and not at the individual level, which may only happen, once every century, like what we've all been going through for 16, 18 plus months, it's all part of this divine thing, growth and development, and this divine thing that it is to be human. Everything is exactly as it should be because it is. So, as I mentioned, this past year and a half has been a turning point for everyone in some way, shape, or form. And life in this pandemic has been an instigator and a motivator for a great number of people to really re-examine their lives and how they've been living it and how they might want and wish to live it going forward, once we can kind of move out of this in-between, uncertain, still dealing with all of what we've been dealing with for so long. And we might not have otherwise done that. So, and there's a lot going on in addition to, life didn't really stop in entirety because of the pandemic. We've been dealing with news from around the world, and really close to home, we've been examining and re-examining our movements around ongoing racism and increased advocacy for personal mental health, if not fully at the macro level, or at the societal level, but our own steps that we can take to take control and charge of our personal mental health. We've also, especially recently here, been have had our eyes opened yet again to some of the things that are very close to home, that are very painful for us to remember and step into knowledge of. And in all of this, with everything that we are going through, it's actually left, in my view, us feeling much less certain about so many things before that used to feel certain. And beyond anything else, beyond life changes, adjustments and accommodations that we have to make, freedoms we have to give up, we as human beings, we don't like to feel uncertain. We like to know what's happening, even if what's happening isn't good or ideal. We just want to know. And, the paradox of this experience is that while it's pulled us all together into the same storm, we've all been in very different boats, so to speak. So I think one of the things that I'm going to be speaking on today is how we create happiness in an environment like this. How do we create happiness when we're facing difficult times, when our freedoms we've had to give up so much of freedom? There's an old saying, if you're not free, can you ever really be happy? And I would say yes, it just requires much, much more creativity and much more purposeful intention around it. So it's, I guess, creating a happy life for yourself really starts with understanding, firstly and foremostly, that you deserve happiness. It's something that you have the right to achieve. It's not something that is going to drop out of the sky. I think one of the misconceptions that we have about happiness is that it's externally, it comes from our external life and external experiences, such as enjoying a nice day on the beach, or having a patio dinner with friends, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to starting this weekend and going forward. But those are actually sensations, and sensations are different from this feeling of happiness. Sensations are things like pleasure and joy and excitement and pain and things like that. They're transient. They happen and then they move along. Whereas happiness is this overarching feeling of contentment and peace that lasts. That's by my definition. And so it comes from the totality of our life's experience. And of course, it comes from how we are approaching life personally, mentally, and behaviorally. So in my experience, I worked for almost 10 years as a therapist in direct work with people and counseling them. And in my experience, there's sort of three types of people. The first type is very small, very minority number of people who really struggle on a day-to-day basis with their mental health, with their behavior, with really just functioning in society. And that's actually a rather small percentage. It's still too high, and we still want to support and address that. But the vast majority of people fall, in my view, in the second category, which is really stable, functioning people. They often experience happiness. They maybe even really successful in their life. They often have families, relationships, children. They're contributing members to society. Sometimes they feel up, sometimes they feel down. Sometimes they go through mental, physical illness like anybody else. But they're not feeling fully connected and consciously thriving in their life through whatever the ups and downs are, feeling totally connected to it and living it through in a conscious, intentional way. And that is the third category, which I call this sort of highest level self or higher living self. And what those are people who are possibility oriented always. They're not obstacle oriented. Obstacle oriented people are individuals, who would, see the first sign of something that could prevent them from doing something. Whereas possibility oriented people will never think that. If an obstacle comes in their way, because that does happen, then they'll switch direction. They live with a sense of contentment and self-love and other love. And an example of the easiest, if there's people out there who have children, and I'm sure that they do, they are the original highest living people. And they are a living example of, without even having to try, they are actually born highest level selves. Now, that doesn't mean they always have good judgment and can consent to things. And of course, they need adults to guide them and keep them safe and alive. But they are the original highest living creatures. And unfortunately, too many of us are taught out of being this way. So how do we reach that higher level self? And how do we create hope for a future when we're not even sure what that future is going to look like? When we feel like we can't even plan for the next 6 months, the next 6 weeks even, although things are certainly getting better. I've been giving these presentations, all year long and last year, and not a single one of them has been the same because things are changing so much. So I'm going to start with the first slide, and what I'm going to take you through in hopefully about a half an hour is where I want to cut off, so I leave lots of time for Q&A at the end. It's my sort of pearls of inner wisdom is what I call them. And I've limited them to just 4 or 5 so that we can really drill down to the key tools and things for you to focus on that you can actually use today to take better control of your own well-being. We talked about that. Pearls of inner wisdom, the top 5 mental turning points for you. So the first one is what you focus on expands. I had a client who I worked with for a long time. And last year, before I officially sort of stepped away from working with clients, he asked me during all of this, we were on one of our virtual sessions, and he asked me, he's like, Natasha, do you ever get depressed? And I said, no. And he said, well, never? Like, do you never feel depressed or get into that state of mind where you just feel like depression? And I said, well, first of all, depressed is kind of an inflammatory word, but I sometimes feel negative emotions. I don't always feel great or happy or joyous or excited. But no, I don't think I ever feel truly depressed. And he said, wow, that's depressing. And I laughed and I said, and he's asking me, well, how and why? And the best answer that I could give him is that, I have a better toolkit. That's it. I'm a human just like him, just like you all listening, like everyone else. And I have all the same experiences and exposed to the same storm and some experiences are different and so forth. And I have problems just like everyone else. But the difference is that the way we approach those problems. Happy people have all the same problems as unhappy people. It's just how they approach them. And when I say that what we focus on expands, literally, the more you focus on the abundance of negatives in your life, even if they're small, even if there's just like 1 or 2 or 3 negative things that genuinely are negative, then that will mentally consume your focus, what you focus on those, and to the detriment of anything else that's either neutral or positive in your life. That will fill up your mental space, and it will trick you into believing that is what your life is, the totality of your life, so to speak. And by the same token, if you focus on what's positive or at least neutral or fine in your life, then that becomes the essence or the sort of sum totality of your life at the end of the day. Now, that's not to say that you're not acknowledging negatives. And that's not to say that you're trying to turn negative things into positives, because that's not the approach that I'm after. And I do know that there's a lot of misconception about what a positive approach to life is. It's kind of like that you're happy all the time, that you're happy-go-lucky, peachy, Pollyanna, everything's great. There's a silver lining to everything. I'm here to say, no, I don't agree with that, because sometimes there are things that are legit problems. They legitimately feel sad. They make us sad. They make us worried. They make us distressed. The key is leaning into those negative emotions without inflating them into catastrophic versions of those negative emotions, which then, of course, expands into what will create this emotional distress. And when we do have problems in our lives and we do encounter negative things, we work to solve them if we can, or we cope with them as best as we can without inflaming them, at the same time acknowledging and trying to focus on those aspects of our lives that are going well. And some days that list might be very small. It might be far and few in between. But that's the essence of this. Focusing on what you focus on expands. So the next time you have a problem, I want you to do this, take this set of tools away with you. I want you to try reshaping how you think about those problems to be more realistic, using this technique of asking yourself these 3 questions, okay? Isn't this problem more of a hassle and a concern for you rather than a true catastrophe? And this is something that we do. It's sort of a product of where we live in the world and the circumstances for most of us, where we have a tendency to catastrophize small things because there aren't a whole lot of big things. Now, we all have a sort of big thing, and to various degrees, some of us are experiencing this in really unfortunate ways, really painful ways, while others are weathering this with boredom and loneliness as their sole complaints. So, you have a whole spectrum of problems, so to speak. But really ask yourself, is it a hassle and a concern? Is it something that I'm blowing out of proportion? And most of the time you will find out that it is more of a hassle and a concern. It's an inconvenience. And language is very key, because when you tell yourself that, you're emotionally going to respond differently to if you say, oh my God, like this is crazy, this is a catastrophe, this is awful, this is horrible. The second thing is, ask yourself, aren't you likely to solve your problem and find a way to be happy in the end? And this is a really strong technique, because in the moment we forget about how many times in our adult lives we've encountered a problem in life, and how many times we either A, solved it eventually and got past it and did feel good again, or B, coped with it because we couldn't do anything about it and eventually let it go. And it's important to remember that we have the power to do that. And I'm certain all of you have already done that multiple times, even if you weren't conscious about it. So it's very important to remember that. The third thing is, aren't you the type of person who is strong and actually able to handle any problem that comes your way? And this just comes down to confidence and self-belief. If you believe that in the face of challenge, in the face of real difficulties, that you're made of it, you've got it, you have the resilience to, it might not be easy, and there might be pain, and there might be sadness, and there might be stress. That's part of the human experience, but we can minimize that as much as possible by just believing and reminding ourselves that we actually have the strength and the power to move through life's challenges, and we will. We will get to the other side. The good passes, so savor it, and the bad eventually passes, so we will cope and solve where possible. Okay. Second pearl of inner wisdom, if you will. Focus on what you can control. Many of you may have already heard this advice frequently over the course of the pandemic, because it's so important and it's so relevant right now. But we don't have a lot of control over many things out there. We certainly don't have a lot of control right now. Everyone has stepped into feeling a loss of control. But we always, no matter what the circumstances are, we always have control over one thing, and that's ourselves. how we want to show up, how we want to interpret the environment that we're in, the behavior of others, the actions around us, the things that people do and say that we don't have a magic wand over. We really can't control much else other than how we're going to show up and respond to something. So I want you all to imagine a very extreme circumstance, which is to be kept in solitary confinement, where you have no contact with anybody. I know a lot of us feel like we've had a version of that, but truly the real thing where you have no vision, you have no auditory, you have no visual stimulation, you would have to dig down in order to really survive. It would be possible. And again, I'm not saying that this would be easy in my very extreme example, but the only way you would be able to come out of that with some, or cope and move through it, would be to develop strategies, mental strategies or mind control in order to survive in it. And actually what studies have shown is that is exactly what people will do. None of us has likely been in a situation like that at all. But what we know from the history of humanity, and we're living proof of it yet again, which I'll speak to at the end of my presentation, that is what we do. We will find ways to cope and adapt and ultimately come out so that we can thrive again. So focusing on what you control. If you have a problem, take the time to think about it. Deal with it effectively as you possibly can, and then let it go. If you can't do anything about a situation or a problem, i.e., you don't have control, then let it go. So the common thing here, when there's a problem or a situation out there, whether you can control it or not, is eventually letting it go. If you can do something, great, do it, let it go. Whatever the outcome ends up being. If you can't, find a way to accept, cope, let it go. It's extremely important to learn this art of surrendering and acceptance, because it's incredibly freeing and it just relieves the emotional burden that most of us carry around with us. Okay. Don't blame others or the world. So I'm going to share a story. It's a personal story about my next door neighbors, or our next door neighbors. And I don't think I've met a single human in the world who hasn't had a good neighbor story, maybe a bad neighbor story. But our neighbors, we used to get along with them quite well. And then because of the pandemic and just being at home in our backyards, we're close by, like there's not a whole lot of space between our corner house and their house. They're the only one next to us. And unfortunately, it's turned very sour, and they're just not very respectful of the shared space. And I don't want to, I'm not going to overly negativize, but they're not particularly kind or respectful or really caring or social in that regard. On top of that, unfortunately, they've made it their business to make our lives miserable as much as they can. Anytime we're outside, they'll play loud music as much as on purpose, as loudly as they can, blow the leaf blower, just make noise, even go so far as to actually hurling insults at us over the fence or on the lawn, to which we have a couple choices here. Okay. We could either, we being myself and my husband, we have also 2 kids. I could respond to him. I could just shoot that ball right back to him and say, you frickin' a-hole, you're such a jerk, just why don't you just shut up? And I could just throw it right back the way he's throwing the ball at me this way. It's his choice. He's choosing to do that. And yeah, I guess it's an option, but I could just throw it back in kind. A second option is, of course, to ignore him completely. However, if it continues on and on, a third option is, of course, to make it clear that you don't appreciate that behavior, ask them to stop. And if they don't, there might be other options that we might have to consider. But I guess the whole point of this is that, which of these options do you think is going to make you feel the best? In the moment, and I have been there, and I'm sure you all have too. It doesn't matter if I'm in the mental health field. It doesn't matter how many degrees I have. We are all human. We all have some very basic instincts, and we have all been there where we have hurled it back in kind. Am I right? And it feels really good in the moment. And then later it feels terrible for most of us. It feels like, we lowered ourselves to someone else's level, or we just didn't respect or maybe exercise some compassion as to where they might be coming from, or maybe feel, it's really unfortunate that they're choosing to go there. So take responsibility for the choices, the options you have to respond to the situation, because responsibility, if you think about it, response, okay, how you're going to respond, and then ability. You are able and have the ability to choose your response. So take responsibility for how you want to show up. It's not easy. If you're not at fault for something, be accountable for how you respond to it. If you are at fault for something, if you've done something that's caused someone to be unhappy, take responsibility for it, apologize, forgive yourself, and move on. And that's just it. Okay. That actually I'm going to save. Actually, I'm missing a slide here. I am missing a slide. That is okay. I'm going to go back to this slide because the point that I want to talk about next is what you don't face controls you. So this is related to control. Focusing on what you control is important, and knowing that what you don't actually face in life or come to terms with is going to control you. So let me explain with another story about myself. One of my pet peeves used to be, and still is, if I'm being honest, dangerous drivers. And there are a lot of dangerous drivers in our big city where I live in Toronto, and it seems to be getting worse. And years ago, before I sort of stepped into what this mindset and started to understand it and live it and now teach it, I used to say to myself as I was on the road, and I would make myself really upset and distressed when I would get cut off, or I'd see people blowing through stop signs, or I'd see people like blowing through school bus stops, like where kids were crossing. That's terrible. But that's definitely not good. And I would get myself really, really worked up, and I would kind of say things like, if I had magical powers, I would just be able to zap anybody on the road that I want. I can choose, and then you're gone. Like you're not driving anymore. You've just you've disappeared from the road. And of course, this was a lot what we call magical thinking, hence the term magical powers. And, later on, my future self, higher self would say, no, that's not what you would do if you were your higher self. That's not what you would need. And so, some time passed, and I started stepping more into this mindset and understanding. And I said, well, kind of bringing it down, saying, well, fine, I don't need to do that. But what I would really love to do is, if there was some app or something, or if there was some really quick and safe way, I could just like scan their license plate, and just like it would get sent off to the police, and they could give them a ticket, and at least they'd have a natural consequence. And then maybe this would go down. And again, that future higher self, which only came later, realized, no, that's actually not what you would do if you were your higher self. The higher level self, my highest level self, when I finally got there, was no longer making myself distressed and disturbed by these drivers. Now, that's not to say that I like it. And that's not to say that I'm going to condone dangerous driving in any way. I'm actually living for the day when self-driving vehicles come, or when we're all like just picked up by these robot cars. I think that's actually going to be a really good thing. Maybe I could be wrong. But the point is that I was making myself distressed over a situation that I couldn't control. So it controlled me. When I finally faced the power that I had and my responsibility, or what I was able to control, it no longer controlled me. When we don't face our problems and the things, what distresses us says a lot about us, not the thing that distresses us. So learn, it's actually very important to know what distresses you. How are you making yourself distressed, and over what? And where do you feel the most upset and angry and just like fired up and distressed? That tells you a lot about yourself and who you are, and you can use that information. An alcoholic, let's say, who is struggling with an addiction, who isn't in treatment and isn't taking care to get treatment and seek treatment, he or she is controlled by that problem. Whereas the alcoholic who's in treatment, who's seeing a therapist, who's in a rehabilitation program, who is actively facing that problem, is actually no longer controlled by it, even if they're not where they want to be, even if they're still drinking, even if they're still struggling with it, they're actually no longer controlled by it. So that's just what I wanted to share there. Okay. Loving and accepting yourself without any conditions is very, very important. Probably the most important tip in this presentation. And the reason I say that is because in the self-help and personal wellness field, we seem to have gotten things a bit in reverse. And what I mean by that is we live in a world right now, especially here in Canada and North America, the sort of Western world, where access and information to like this, exactly what we're doing today, but also books and courses and resources and articles. There's a huge focus on mental health in terms of education, if not a culture of wellness, which if I have time, I'll talk about that in a few moments. But we're doing it in reverse. We should be starting with actually learning how to love and respect ourselves and value ourselves. Because if we don't do that, it actually won't matter how many therapy sessions we have. If we don't already value ourselves beyond anything else, nothing that we do to try and help ourselves change for the better will actually be taken and enacted, because you can't put effort into something that you don't value. And that's why when I worked with clients, the first and foremost thing that I always checked in with them is gauge what is their level of unconditional self-love and acceptance. How much do they value themselves? Because if they don't, then we have to start there, because nothing else I can teach them will matter. They won't put it in action. There's something called effort justification. Leon Festinger is the scientist who came up with this. And the more effort we put into something, and you of all people, this audience will understand this, because care is a form of effort. Anything you do for another human being, including yourself, requires effort. Effort is a reflection of care and valuing something, whatever that effort looks like. There's hundreds of millions of ways in which we can put effort. The more effort we put into something, the more we value it. And the more we value something, the more effort we will put into it. So it works in reverse. It's both ways. So when we value ourselves first, as the first step in the equation, it becomes very easy to want to put effort into that thing that we value, to take care of it, to keep it safe, to safeguard it, to nurture it, to water it, to love it, and express love through actions to it, ourselves and then to others that we value as well. An analogy is that if you own something, and it's interesting, I think it was last year, where I read some research about people who are more likely to give their pets their medications on time, never miss them, but they won't do that for themselves. And that is phenomenal. Somehow we are either innately or socialized to care less about ourselves and care more about others. Now, my hypothesis on that is there was certainly some advantage to that back when we lived tribally, and we needed our community very much to survive. And now what we have to do is strike a balance of living individually, taking care of our individual self, while at the same time caring for and being involved in our community and caring for others as part of that equation. So if you had something that was valuable to you, be it a human being or a pet or an object, even like if you had a necklace or a favorite piece of jewelry that you loved, you wouldn't just fling it in a drawer. You would put it in a nice velvet case, and you would make sure that it's in a drawer, like tucked away somewhere where it's safe. And maybe you would even have insurance on it if it was valuable. So, these are things that we do for others, for our pets, for animals, for our objects, the things in our life. And yet somehow we deeply struggle with doing this for ourselves. And I'm here to try and make it very simple by saying that it literally starts with understanding that you are worthy just because you're here. You don't have to be worthy to anybody else, although I'm sure most of you are, not all of you are. But just by virtue of being alive and here, it doesn't matter what you did yesterday, it doesn't matter what you'll do tomorrow, it doesn't matter what happened 15 years ago. There may be people who had to exit your life because of things that happened, things you did, things they did, circumstances as they may be. But no matter what, you are always worthy of your own self-love to the same degree every day. And if you can wrap your head around that concept, the steps to make positive change and create a life that you love and is happy will be so easy because you believe that you deserve it. Okay. Just looking at time, we have about 7-ish minutes or so. So I'm going to try to end this with, I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about caregiving, because obviously for obvious reasons, before I close. And when we care for other people, when we actually put effort into doing things for other people, and the motivation isn't always the same. Sometimes we care for others out of the pure joy of our heart. It's pure, it gives us pure enjoyment to do so. And I actually have done quite a bit of research in this for some of the things I've created and developed in my career. And I know that caring and kindness has extremely powerful effects at the biological level and mental level as to how we feel. And what's fascinating is that as long as we're healthy, we have to be healthy and well first, but in a position of strength and general health, good health and happiness, when we care for others and put effort into others, we derive more benefits from that than when we receive. And that's brilliant and fascinating. And there is one story in particular. I've actually worked with in my career a number of people who are giving care to family members, to loved ones, and I'm not talking about parents to children, which is a very different kind of caregiving. I'm talking about the opting in type of caregiving, or the ones that we feel compelled to do or dutifully bound to do, which, by the way, nobody is. And I can share that story. I'll leave it for the Q&A. And if anyone is interested in me sharing confidentially, of course, one particular story really stands out in my mind about a young woman who was caring for her mother, and how to establish a balance between herself and that caregiving such that she was able to live in a state of happiness and create a life that she could be happy with as well. So that's kind of what I wanted to say on that. And the last things I'm going to say are just to kind of close off. I think that a lot of people believe that, or maybe wondering, maybe they're not sure what they believe, but are wondering how we are being shaped by everything that we've gone through over the last year and a bit. And many, I think I've heard, believe that, or are already suggesting that we're going to have all kinds of problems adjusting back, and we won't know what to do with ourselves when the restaurants go green light on Saturday, and the shops, I think, open tomorrow. I'm not sure about the full plan, but that they won't be able to enjoy life again, that they may have lost the edge, that we will be permanently dull, or permanently less shiny and bright, and maybe carry a smidge of languish around with us. And I don't think so. And I think that we are going to adjust quickly to whenever we're able to kind of come back to the full extent of our lives as we know them. And I'm very optimistic, keeping in with my optimism. I could be wrong, but I'm very hopeful that people are going to much more consciously create a life that they want to live. I think people are gaining perspective, and situations like this do this, gaining perspectives on relationships that they want to have and maybe leave, and end up at the end of this with a set of relationships in their lives that are deeply meaningful and only serve them, don't take away from them. Not that they're perfect, but only serve them, that they derive joy from. I think people are going to be more open-minded to understanding their habits and our lifestyle and the culture that we have, which doesn't support personal wellness. We don't actually live in a culture yet that supports wellness and balance and healthiness. We can do it at the individual level, but our culture still isn't there. And I think that people are going to be more willing than ever to re-examine how they live. Sustainability, and the environment, and frugality, and perhaps materialism, and work, like the amount that we work. I'm hoping people will be able to understand that we may require stepping back a little bit in the way that we live in being able to create a life that we love, and also a global life that can be sustainable and happy on a social level for everybody. And I think we're just going to enjoy, I hope that we're going to enjoy life more. And I believe that we will. I think we're going to jump out there and savor it. And people will finally understand what people in my field have known for years, decades, which is that savoring what is good is so important, is so key to your feeling of happiness and well-being. And everything passes. All the good passes in our life too. So savoring it and really noting your enjoyment of it is key. And then the bad passes, as I mentioned as well. So really understanding that you can solve it where you can, or cope with it where you can't. And then it too will be you will move on from it. So final note, we're at a major turning point, all of us. There's no question about it. And we don't know where it's going to go. We've learned that we are resilient. We have learned, in my view, that we have what it takes. We're actually living proof of our own resilience and our own strength to be able, for the most part, there's been some exceptions, but for the most part, we as a country, as a nation, as a world, for the most part, have pulled together to jointly do what we think we need to do, with adjustments all the time, what we think is the right thing to do to help ourselves and to help get ourselves into a healthy place. And we're resilient. It's not easy, and we're not all dealing with the same thing, but we have shown ourselves that we can be at the other end of it and be alive. And the choice on where we want to go from here is completely up to you. There's a story I'll end with, and that's about two people. It could be, let's say that they're two men, and they're twin brothers. And they grew up in a very dysfunctional home, unfortunately. They grew up with a father who was alcoholic and who was emotionally unavailable and neglectful and just not present. So one of the boys grows up and becomes, like his father. Exactly the same, falls into the same kinds of problems, difficulty in functioning, can't contribute to society, held down relationships and employment. And the other one actually goes on and does the opposite and is able to function and form relationships and be educated and live a healthy lifestyle and contribute to the community. And when they ask the first one, well, why are you like this? And he says, it's because of my father. And they ask the second one, well, why are you like this? The one who's a success. And the answer is, because of my father. And the moral of that, I think, should be hopefully obvious, which is that no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what is going on around us, even if it's difficult, systemically difficult, socially difficult, globally difficult, we always have the choice to decide how we're going to live, what the future is going to look like for us. And I encourage you to think about how you want your future to look and how you can design and create a life that you can live with intention that is designed by you with the tools and as you're able to do it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma. It was great presentation, wonderful introduction to the subject.